So I'll present first, and I'd like to talk to you about rethinking what a story is. At its very core, what is a story? So ever since Aristotle, people have been looking at story through a temporal lens, beginning, middle, and first act, second act, third act, inciting incident, rising action, denouement. But I started to wonder if there was another way to understand story. If there was another way to look at it, not in the progression of what happens, but at the elemental level of what lies at the heart of a story. And I believe there is. Every story that we tell has four elements to it, and all great stories. So the first element to every story is a story needs a character. Without a character, you might have a series of events, you might have a description of a location, but you won't have a story itself. Now, ideally, your character will be someone that readers or listeners, in the case of telling a story, can identify with. Hopefully, it's someone who is admirable in some way, vulnerable in some way, and ideally unforgettable. So we don't want to just use a generic character so much. If you can create something about that character that is intriguing or interesting, that'll be ideal. So that doesn't seem too surprising that a story needs a character. It also needs a setting. So it needs to occur in a place and time so we can picture it. If people can't imagine or picture the story, they won't be able to track along with it. So a character that we can identify with, a setting that we can picture, imagine, and maybe feel something toward. And the third is a struggle. So something has to go wrong. Some people might say, well, you need the plot of the story, and I understand where they're coming from, but if nothing goes wrong, you don't have a story. You simply have a series of events occurring. So one of the key questions as you shape a story to tell is asking yourself, what goes wrong? It isn't just what happens, but what goes wrong. I remember when I was teaching on story and storytelling years ago at a school, and at the school, it was right after a summer vacation. And all the students had been told to write down what they did over the summer. And so they just listed, I played games, I went to camp, I listened to music, and so on. So I said to the students, don't tell me what you did over the summer, but could anyone tell me about something that went wrong? So this one boy said, my cousin came over to my house. We were having a contest to see who could jump the farthest off the bunk bed. And so I said, okay, what happened? He said, well, he jumped first. I said, I can get farther than that. So I said, did anything go wrong? He said, well, I backed up to the wall to get a running start. And I jumped off the top bunk and the ceiling fan was on. He said, the ceiling fan caught my head and it threw me against the wall. But I got farther. So if I would have asked this boy, what did you do? He would have said, I played with my cousin. But because I said, tell me what went wrong, he told me a story. I call it the ceiling fan principle. And that is, you do not have a story until something goes wrong. So those are the first three: character, setting, struggle. The next is a pursuit. Pursuit is where a character has a desire and takes purposeful steps to try and accomplish, obtain, or avoid something. So at the heart of every story is tension, and at the heart of tension is unmet desire. So stories at their very core are not just about events occurring, but pursuit of a character who desires something he doesn't have. So you might say, but Steve, what is plot? I've heard all about plot, and you're talking about story, and you don't even mention plot. Well, plot is simply the pathway a character takes through the setting, during the struggle, in his pursuit. So you can have a story with just those first four elements. You can have a story about a character who's pursuing something and tries hard, struggles, and gets it. But it probably won't be super memorable. It might be very predictable. So that brings us to the next side of the cube. And this is what I call, I know you can't probably read my cube, but the pivot. The pivot or twist, maybe. So I used to play basketball, and when you play basketball, someone throws you the ball. You can place one foot and pivot or turn while you hold the ball. Your goal is maybe to shoot or to pass, and you don't want the other team to know what you're going to do. So you might fake it, pass. But if it's too predictable, they'll just take the ball from you or swat and knock your shot to the ground. So the pivot is where a story goes into a certain direction that makes logical sense, but it's not too predictable. So the pivot would be where it's unexpected. You don't see that coming. But when it happens, we say, yes, that makes sense. I understand where that's coming from. So when you look at your story, you're not just looking at how to tell people about your company, your values, or maybe a customer or client. Look for what is not what it appears to be. Look for what does not go as you expect it. That is probably the place where your story resides. Okay, so number 6, the last one. On the cube, I call it the payoff. Now, the payoff is kind of like the value of the story. So a story goes in a direction we don't anticipate or expect, and it has deeper meaning even than we anticipated. Now, sometimes the pivot and the payoff can happen at the same moment. At the end of the story, for instance. I was thinking of this old teaching story from the Middle East. And it's about a man who was thinking other people should serve him. He didn't have any food, and he wished that people would bring him some food and take care of him better. Well, one day he was in the jungle and he saw a fox with no legs. And he thought that was strange. And soon a tiger came along carrying some meat, some food. And the tiger ate his fill as much as he wanted. And then he gave the rest of the food to the fox. And so the fox ate and was happy. Now, The man thought, this is strange. I've never seen anything like this before. So the next day he came back and watched. Sure enough, there's the fox. And here comes the tiger. The tiger left some food and the fox ate it and was happy. So the man said, I understand what I need to do. So he went home and he waited. He waited for someone to bring him some food, someone to pay him some attention. But nothing happened. No one came. He became more and more hungry until finally he was at the point of starving. And he heard this voice, maybe the voice of the Lord, the voice of God, the voice of God. And the voice said, don't you even understand? You were supposed to be the tiger. So if I were using this to pass along the value in my company or the culture of caring for others first, I might say the story and then say, it's our goal as we serve our clients and customers to always be the tiger, to be the one that steps out and shares with those who are in need. So the pivot and the payoff come in that little story at the very end. Now, my friend Tom is about to share a little bit with you about how this applies specifically to some of your experiences. For now, I'd like you just to remember that when you look at a story you might wish to tell, ask yourself, is there character that people will identify with? Is there a setting they can see? Is there a struggle that matters? Is there a pursuit based on desire? Is there a pivot where a surprise comes? And the payoff where the value resides? So if I can, Artem, I'll pass the presentation over to my friend Tom. I don't know if it's worked or not, so I'll wait a moment to see.
Well, I can clearly see Tom joining us and dropping off the air. That sometimes happens when the browser is not updated fully. So could be cured with an update, or just shifting a browser to Edge or Firefox. But yeah, that sometimes may be an issue. Tom, if you hear us, just try switching and connecting with a different browser. Some technical difficulty, but still, thank you so much for explaining it with the cube that's physical. That was awesome. Let's wait for Tom here.
And if for some reason you're not able to get him on, Artem, I'm glad to speak more in depth about some of the aspects that I was talking about.
Oh, maybe we could, yes, let's try once more. Tom is just now logging in. So maybe we can still hear from him. And if not, then I'll just pass it on back to you. Yeah, it seems that, Stephen, it's all yours, and I'll be keeping off the air for some time now.
All right, well, let me talk about then the moment in this paradigm, this way of looking at story that most people struggle the most to understand. And that is really the pivot. So for most of us, we can understand how a story builds in action, builds in tension and momentum. And then there's some sort of resolution. But what is it that moves from the struggle to that resolution? This is why some case studies don't really work that great in sharing stories. So for instance, if you were telling a story about a customer and you say he tried other brands or companies and he just wasn't satisfied, then he came to us and he found everything that he was hoping for. Well, you have a character, you have a struggle and pursuit, but there's no pivot. There's no moment where things go into an unexpected direction. So very often, if you watch a movie, if you hear a story, if you read a novel, you'll come to a moment at which all seems lost. A moment where you as the listener or the viewer, if it's a movie or a film, you say, I have no idea how they're going to get out of this. It seems impossible for the two lovers to get together at the end, or for the detective to solve the mystery, or for the hero to save the village. I say, I have no idea how that will happen. That's when the pivot comes. That's when the moment that we didn't anticipate but do appreciate arrives in the story. And so sometimes the pivot occurs because of the cleverness or the perseverance of your character. And sometimes we foreshadow the ending by dropping a hint to where things might go, dropping that hint earlier in the story. So sometimes I tell the story of when I moved to the city that I live in many years ago. I started to see a barber named Brian. Now, every time I would go to get my hair cut, Brian would tell me about how he did not love his job. He would complain about having to stand on his feet every day, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. And he'd been doing it for 40 years. And so I have to admit, I became a little tired of hearing him talk about his problems. I kind of just wish the moment would be over with, but I continued to go back to get Brian to cut my hair. And one day Brian said, in 3 years, I'm going to retire. And when I retire, I'm going to take up fishing. I'm going to go hunting. I'll learn to play golf. I'll finally enjoy myself. And so from then on, when I went in to get my hair cut, Brian would count down the days. In 2.5 years, I'll finally retire. Then in 2 years, 1.5 years, and every time he would tell me about all the things he would finally be able to do. The hunting, the fishing, the golfing. And so as it came down to the last few weeks before his retirement, I went to get my hair cut, and I came to the door of the barber shop. It was locked and closed. There was a sign on it that said that Brian was in the hospital, that he had had a heart attack, and they were asking for thoughts and prayers of people. Well, Brian never came home. He spent 43 years working in a job he didn't love, looking forward to a day that never came. And so now, whenever I go in to get my hair cut, I catch myself if I'm doing the same thing he did. If I'm thinking someday thoughts, if I'm thinking someday when I retire, I'll be happy. Someday I'll be able to play with my grandchildren and I'll be happy. So now whenever I get my hair cut and I press the door open, I'm not wishing that the moment was over. I'm just thankful for the moments that I have. So I could certainly tell you the story and just say, there was a barber who was unhappy and died. That wouldn't be much of a story. But if I can pivot it and you see this isn't so much a story about Brian as it is about Steve, then we find out it's not just a story about someone who died. It's a story about someone who discovered a new appreciation for life. So in that way, it moves from just a series of events, pivots toward a payoff. So I saw something flash up on my screen. I don't know if it was Tom or Artem coming in. I'm just going to check to see how much time I have.
You still have 10 minutes for a Q&A, and we have some questions in the chat. Tom, unfortunately, is jumping in and then going back down. So would you like me to read them out, or do you see the chat?
Yeah, if you could read them. For some reason on my phone, it's not showing the chat right now.
No problem. Okay, so values are deep in nature, and how can the leader convey the value in a simpler way through story? Asked me.
I think very often a good way to do that is to tell a story from your own life where you found out the how valuable that lesson or value was. So for instance, if it's a story about forgiveness, maybe you could tell a story about when you experienced forgiveness or withheld forgiveness, and then how your attitude changed. So looking in your life for those pivotal moments, those moments where you shifted in your understanding of that value or of that virtue that you're trying to share. So think through and say, before this moment, I thought or experienced things this way. After that moment, there was a change. And very often that change, that moment, that illumination or new idea is valuable when you can share with your constituents.
Awesome. There are some more, and I would love to quote them to you. So
Sure.
Adel is asking, what if a leadership team is unable to see a pivot? Sometimes people choose to stick with what they know instead of exploring what they do not know. How do you encourage folks to consider their pivots?
If you can find a way to help them discover on their own instead of you necessarily telling them what they have to or should believe, sometimes that can be very effective. So sometimes I tell people, don't tell people what they already know in a way they already expect. So if you were to, avoid telling someone what they already know in a way they anticipate or already expect. So for instance, if I were speaking to a group and I was trying to get them to communicate better with each other or trust each other more, if I just say to them, you should communicate better, you should trust each other more, it probably won't have much of an effect. But if I can find a way to allow them to make that discovery through a story that I tell, very often there will be a deeper impact. So to do that, to teach a virtue in that way, it's better to show the consequences of doing the opposite rather than the value of doing what you want them to do. So instead of saying you should trust each other because all these good things will happen, if you were to tell a story about an incident where you didn't trust someone and show the negative consequences, then you allow the listeners to say, I don't want that to happen to me. I want to avoid that behavior. And on their own, then, they end up appreciating the value or virtue that you're trying to share.
Awesome. You know, I had one question from myself about the cube.
Yeah.
Because when I was translating the slides, I clearly saw that 4 components were there upfront, and then the 2 components were added later on. So is it that the 4 are the basis and the 2 are extras, or it's, the connection between them is just, that there's a basis or advanced part? So
that's a good question. So I believe that many stories are told with just those first 4 elements: the character, setting, struggle, and pursuit. But they usually aren't very memorable stories. They're just based on events occurring so much. But the stories that really impact us, that really are effective, those are ones that always include the pivot moment and that payoff where we as listeners say, that was worth my time. That story had deeper meaning for me. So as I coach storytellers and business leaders, I'm always trying to get them to think through, especially the pivot and payoff. The rest of it sort of comes naturally to many people.
Got that. And we still have one more from Alexandra. She's asking if we have time, and we do.
Sure.
Maybe you could share a story that helped create trust in a team.
That is a good question. I'm trying to think if I can come up with a great example of a trust building story. And the only thing that comes to mind very quickly would be a story of when I was in high school. I was a student, and I could see on a team how people were leaning on each other and trusting each other on a basketball team. But I instead wanted to do things my way instead of relying on the other players. And so, so rather than relying on them, trusting them, and so on, I would take it and dribble and shoot myself all the time. And so finally, the coach said, "Steve, what do you think you're doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to, be a great, player." And then he said, "That's your problem." He said, "What you said is I'm trying to be a great player." And then I don't know how this will translate, but he said, "There's no letter I in the word team." So he said, "You should be thinking of we, of the team, instead of just you as the player." So it helped me to remember in that case that success was always based on cooperating with the team instead of me just doing it on my own.
Alexandra is writing that
off the top of my head. That's just a quick one.
Alexandra is writing that she got essentially what she was looking for. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. Yes.
Stephen, one more from me, and it's going to be a classic now.
Oh, wow. What?
Yeah, well, who would have thought? So a culture forms the stories we live and tell, and the stories form the culture we live in. So in your opinion, which is the first, the culture or the story?
I actually think the story. And here's why I think that. I believe that stories are so powerful that they can influence, entire generations. They can reshape even entire civilizations. And so I feel like our job as leaders, as storytellers and communicators, is to be really careful with the stories that we tell. In other words, what does this story celebrate? What does this story condemn? Or what does it justify? Or so asking yourself very carefully, is this story encapsulate and celebrate something that we would value and that's virtuous or not? So I love the question though, Artem, so I love the different views and perspectives on it.
Everyone is trying to cheat a little bit and find a way to just combine those two, because they are ultimately inseparable. So Stephen, thank you so much for sharing with us, and say my thanks to Tom for joining, even though he didn't make it. So anyway, you both are awesome, and the link to your book that you co-authored is in the comments. Guys, let's show the fire to our last speakers of the day. Stephen, it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, and I appreciate you putting this together, and thank you for allowing me and allowing both of us to be a part of it. Thank you.